From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Monday, August 7th. Over the last couple of months, Sydney streets have been plagued by murder after murder. They're a byproduct of turf warfare linked to the lucrative cocaine trade. We've seen this carnage before in various parts of New South Wales. But we're now in the midst of an unprecedented cocaine boom, and experts have warned that the violence it attracts is likely to grow rather than recede. Today, Chief Reporter Jordan Baker on what's behind these latest killings and why Sydney, more than anywhere else in the world, loves cocaine. So Jordan, you've written about Sydney's love affair with cocaine and the carnage that it's recently led to. The gang warfare that's erupted into the city over the last month or two has even made the news overseas. The Spectator magazine in Britain has noted July was a bumper month for bumping off in Sydney. So what can you tell us about all of these murders?
Well, police are still looking into them, and they haven't said whether they think they're all linked or whether just some of them are linked. So the whole thing really kicked off about a month ago with the daylight assassination in Bondi of a guy who had a very colourful history of being involved in what was known as the Golden Gun cocaine syndicate. So he spent all his ill-gotten gains on Versace, and his wife compared him to Tony Soprano. So he was quite well known in the sort of gangster glamour of Sydney. So the fact this happened in Bondi was a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of people, because shootings like this happen relatively regularly in the southwest of Sydney, but Bondi's a rarity. And so from then, there's been others.
Good evening. It's a killing that has all the hallmarks of a brutal gangland hit.
The gangland war has erupted in Sydney.
The underworld shootings that have rocked Sydney, upwards of 100 officers.
Very quick. I was amazed at the speed of the shots. So it's like bang, 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 bang.
Police are growing more and more concerned. The streets of suburban Sydney are becoming a battleground for gangs. Police have now formed...
So there was a shooting at Marrickville. That was just 100 metres from the police station and at a hair salon in the middle of the day. And then last week, there were 5 people shot in 5 days.
After 5 shooting deaths
Five
in
shootings
just 5
that have
days.
happened in the
Five
past
shootings
month.
in 5 days. So it's disturbing and we need some substantial action to deal with it.
So there were 3 incidents in which 5 people were shot. 2 were in the Sydney suburb of Greenacre. One of those involved a target being shot, and he later died in hospital. But in the same event, a couple of bystanders in another car were also caught with a stray bullet. So that was 3 people. There was a lawyer in Greenacre, a criminal lawyer, who was shot and he survived. And then late last week, there was a man fatally shot in the Sydney suburb of Canterbury, which is just on the edge of the inner west, which is a very trendy part of Sydney. Now, there were a couple of school children who walked past his body, which was partially covered on the way to school, and they were photographed. Now, that really upset a lot of people, the idea that these young, innocent people saw this, tattooed gangster dead on a street.
And now that kids are being subjected to it, I guess it makes you worry what the rest of the community is going to be subjected to as well.
The problem is...
So how do you comfort the community when school kids are seeing that?
It's one thing for gang members to shoot up other gang members. It's a whole other thing when it's bystanders that are getting caught up in it. Because we're not gang members. People can't see themselves being caught up in this. But when it's innocent people, that's when we can start seeing ourselves and getting a little bit nervous about our safety. And in this case, when those little kids witnessed something that was really going to scar them, it got a lot of media attention and a lot of pressure was put on the police to do something.
Some of what you've just touched on there really brings me to my next question, which is that you've been a journalist for 25 years. You've unfortunately seen and covered many spates of murder over that time while covering the illegal drug trade and other matters. So is that how this latest round is different? The fact that it's being taken place in somewhat trendy suburbs, your Bondi, your Dulwich Hill, places like that, and the fact that there's bystanders, is that what's distinguishing this particular round?
Look, I would say this isn't too different to other shootings. Perhaps it's actually not as bad. I mean, there have been shootings in Dulwich Hill and Marrickville for ages. It's just that those suburbs haven't been as gentrified in the past as there are now. And there have been violent drug disputes in Sydney for more than a century. I mean, just looking back to the razor gangs of the 1920s. So these began terrorising the city with razors, partly because chemists stopped selling cocaine legally. And so that's when the gangster trade began. And then in the 60s and 70s, you had Nettie Smith and Roger Rogerson, and that was when the heroin trade was big, and police were actually in on that. In the 1980s, there was a Milperro massacre between the Comancheros and the Bandidos when they opened fire in a car park, killing 7 people, including a young girl. And then in the 90s, that was a big scandal about the drug problems and the gang warfare in Cabramatta. They used to call the train to Cabramatta the Junkie Express. And there was actually a local MP, John Newman, who was gunned down and killed by a man who police said had links to the drug trade. And then in the early 2000s, there were families involved in big fights over cannabis, and some of these had access to rocket launchers. So by those standards, this series is pretty tame, but it tends to capture people's attention when the incidents come in a very short space of time, like in this spate of shootings, and when innocent bystanders are affected. So that's when people start asking questions and demanding action.
Okay, and you did write in your exceptional feature the other day that this latest round is pretty messy, that, a lot of the hits have been unprofessional, and that's why there's been bystanders that have been sort of taken out, possibly not intentionally. So can you tell us, why is this round sort of particularly messy or potentially even amateurish?
So I was speaking to someone who knows gang behaviour really well, and they said if the gangs are disciplined, if they know what they're doing, if they're sort of more sophisticated criminals, they tend to be a lot more careful when they're doing this stuff. They don't want to bring a whole bunch of police down on themselves. So they'll stake out places, they make sure they get the right person, they're careful not to accidentally shoot anybody else. For example, if they're waiting for someone to get home and a car pulls up, they'll pay close attention to who gets out of the car, and if it's the wife, they'll come back. But as this person was saying, you'd much rather it was someone who was disciplined and careful, because people who are not careful are more likely to make mistakes, and that's when you get, innocent people being caught in the crossfire. But the problem at the moment is that the cocaine trade in Sydney is very lucrative. So Australians consume more cocaine per capita than anywhere else in the world. They're also willing to pay more than almost anywhere else in the world. So there's lots of money going around. There's a lot of people interested in getting in on the action. And you'll get people coming into the business who are pretty amateurish at it. And often these gangs get really young, inexperienced people to do their dirty work, like the actual shooting. They may never actually look these people in the eye. They might leave a gun somewhere for them to pick up. They might pay them a few $1,000s, or just it's the price of belonging to their gang. These young people, might have stars in their eyes about the gangster lifestyle, which is pretty glamorised in Sydney these days. So these are young men barely out of boyhood who are not experienced, who are not disciplined, and they're not very good shots.
Okay, and you've also written that the New South Wales Crime Commission annual report warned of an increase in organised crime-related murders and kidnappings due to a fight for dominance between gangs after COVID-19 reduced sea and air freight to Australia. So what is New South Wales Police doing to combat this?
Well, after a spate of shootings like this, there's a fair bit of public alarm and media attention. So each of these incidents were already being investigated by a strike force. So what they've done is they've made a big show of putting them all together under a single task force.
We realise we have a responsibility. We have a duty to the people of New South Wales, which is why we've slightly changed strategy and created Strike Force Magnus yesterday to try and glean as much information from the common information that we have to resolve these issues.
Now that may sound like splitting hairs, and to a certain extent it is. But it's all about showing that they're putting resources into this, they're giving extra detectives, they're putting about 30 what they call proactive police will actually get onto the streets and pull people over and show the people, particularly of southwest Sydney, that there are, police are onto this.
But we've had victims who've survived shootings who refuse to speak to us and let us know what happened, even though they know what the catalyst and the causes of those shootings have been. So it has been a slow burn, but we have...
So, it's about gathering intelligence, but it's also about just basically public reassurance and letting people know that they are looking at this.
Damage. We have seen innocent people harmed as a result of this conflict over the last couple of years, and they are the investigations that we're really focused on solving. All homicides, no matter who the victim is, are of concern, but when innocent victims are caught up in this, it's of significant concern to us. We realise we have a responsibility.
Okay, but task forces have of course, been established before to tackle this problem. I know you've definitely written about them. So what do you make of the fact that police are once again using a task force to crack down on all this activity?
Well, look, it's one of the only strategies that they've got at their disposal. I mean, there's a lot of pressure when there's been a spate of shootings like this. You know, you had the police commissioner, the deputy police commissioner, the police minister, all facing questions from the media about this last week. But the truth is, they can't just pull a rabbit out of a hat. These investigations take time. They've got to be robust. The evidence has got to stand up in court. So part of this is to say, guys, we're doing something, we're working on this, and it actually gives the police who are investigating the crimes a bit of breathing time to put their heads down and do the work and do their job without the intense media heat. So that's where the police leaders step up and try and absorb some of that heat for them.
We'll be right back. And so I wanted to take a little bit of a step back to talk about just what is this love affair that Australians and Sydneysiders specifically have with cocaine. We're in an unprecedented cocaine boom right now. You've mentioned, that Australians are the highest per capita users of cocaine in the world, which certainly surprised me. I imagine a lot of people wouldn't know that. The latest estimates are that Australians consume 5.6 tons of cocaine a year, and it's not because it's affordable. You've pointed out that the record cocaine prices in Australia are only exceeded by the prices in 2 Gulf states. So why is cocaine having such a moment, and why do Sydneysiders love it so much?
Look, that's $1 million question. I mean, as I said before, the Sydney's loved cocaine since the 1920s when Tilly Devine and Kate Lee were running around with their razor gangs. I mean, one point that people have made is that there's a level of social acceptance of cocaine in Sydney. I mean, heroin was never acceptable. Ice is still considered very dirty. But cocaine's got a kind of elite reputation. It's a high status drug. And you can tell that just from the fact that most of the arrests relating to cocaine have been happening in the eastern suburbs and in the city. So while it's spreading more widely through the city, like basically, people with lots of money everywhere are buying it, it's still considered elite. I mean, I think it was the comedian Richard Pryor who said cocaine is God's way of telling us that we have too much money. It's also a very social drug. It makes people happy and chatty and energetic. I've heard of mothers groups getting together over a few grams of cocaine.
Oh my God.
People like it because it's lower on calories than alcohol. They can stay more alert than they would after a few bottles of champagne. But you do have to be very rich. You have to be able to blow at least $300 a gram up to $450 a gram on cocaine. In comparison, gold is about $90 a gram and a better long-term investment. Just as a word of advice for our listeners. And one of the reasons it's so expensive is because of the huge effort it takes to get it here. So, in the United States, for example, you're only paying $60 to $80 a gram for cocaine because that's coming fairly short distance over a land border from South America. Here, you're smuggling it across the world, basically. It comes via, Southeast Asia. It can come there's a lot of it coming via the Pacific Islands at the moment. People are smuggling it through secure ports at huge financial risk. So when a shipment gets busted, a lot of people stand to lose a lot of money.
Yeah.
And because the prices are so high, though, there's a lot of interest from big international cartels in the Sydney market. So there's a lot of people moving in to try and get a slice of this. And I suppose the other thing about Sydney's love affair with cocaine is, as Deputy Commissioner Dave Hudson pointed out last week, there's a big disconnect between the users and between the people who bring it to them. So I think that's something people don't really think about when they're buying cocaine off, as Hudson said, someone from their own social class. I mean, in Sydney, people use what they call a dial-a-dealer system, in which they'll make a phone call or send a text, and a very fancy black car will drive past, and they'll jump in, they'll ride a few blocks, they'll do their deal, jump out, party on, and they don't really think about all the bloodshed and risk and criminality that it's taken to actually get that drug to that spot, not including all the weird, horrible chemicals it's cut with.
And so it's interesting that you mentioned there just what David Hudson, the Deputy Police Commissioner, had said. He was quoted in your piece as saying, reminding Sydneysiders almost what sounded like an attempt to shame them out of their cocaine habit by saying, You know, they might purchase it from people from same social backgrounds as themselves, and yet they would never associate with those who actually move the drugs at a higher level. So what is the chance that this strategy could actually get people to stop using cocaine? And is it a reflection perhaps of the desperation that the police might feel now to try and just get to the heart of this?
Look, I don't know if I'd call Dave Hudson's comment shaming, but I do think he was trying to make the point that this stuff just doesn't come out of thin air. And it must be really frustrating for police because they see all sides of this. You know, there's the AFP and Border Force who are intercepting huge shipments of this stuff. New South Wales police see the violence on the streets. They do the nightclub arrests. They see the addicts and the people who are spending their life savings on this stuff. And when things blow up like they have recently, they're the ones that put under the pressure to try and catch the crooks. So I'm not surprised he wanted to remind people that, you know, there's a lot of dodgy people taking very big risks and getting an enormous amount of money out of this stuff, and they'll go to great lengths to protect that investment. And look, a Green MP this week sort of pointed out, well, it would all fizzle into nothing if the drugs were made legal. So, you know, yes, it is very frustrating for police, and I'm sure they hope that people will start having a bit more of a connect about what's happening on Sydney's streets and the partying they're doing on Saturday night.
Well, that brings me to my last question, which is at Greens MP, you've just mentioned Kate Fairman. She's not the only person to have mentioned the possibility of legalizing drugs as being another strategy that might combat this whole scenario far better. A police officer that you spoke to told you on condition of anonymity that, you know, all of these gangsters would be on Centrelink in 6 months if the drugs were legalized. So do you think that legalizing drugs could work in a way that task forces haven't traditionally done?
Look, I don't think we're going to know that because I think it's extremely unlikely that legalising cocaine would ever be politically acceptable in New South Wales, at least in the short to medium term. I mean, we still haven't really legalised the recreational use of cannabis. And even though there's been a huge movement towards improving access to cannabis, politicians are still balking at making it legal to drive with cannabis in your system. So in New South Wales, both major parties are really, really conservative on drug stuff. Having said that, a lot of criminality in Sydney used to be driven by illegal gambling, and that's become legal, and we don't have so many problems with that anymore. So maybe in a few decades, we can maybe see a bit of a softening on the drugs policy, but that's not going to happen for a long time. And just back to your previous question on whether I think the warnings from the police, the reminder that it takes a lot of violence to get cocaine to the parties in Sydney is going to stop anyone. No, I don't think it will. I mean, I don't think anyone's unaware of the narcotics wars and the killings and the, you know, horrific beheadings that have happened in South America over the years due to the drug business. And that hasn't stopped Sydney ever. So I don't think this particular outrage will either. I think it will blow over, and in a not too distant future, there'll be another spate of fatal shootings and everyone will get really upset about that, and this will go on and on and on.
Thank you, Jordan, for joining us.
Thank you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.